Happy Friday the 13th, everybody. That's right. It's Friday the 13th, superstition, and, the other aspect of it is those horror movies. As you are probably not surprised to know, there are a couple of Friday the 13th movies that have inhabited the bottom 100. So I watched a couple of them. These two movies, which I'm just going to review together here, because they're both Friday the 13th movies, and actually have some more similarities than you might think. The first of them is Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning. And the other one is Friday the 13th Part 8, or Jason Takes Manhattan. These are both pretty universally reviled by fans of the franchise, which I've talked about this before, but nerd rage fan bases can really turn on anything that's new and different. And both of these not only did new and different things, they did them really badly. So that's where a lot of the similarities are here. Also, they both sort of toyed with the much beloved Jason a bit. I'll start with Part 5. Friday the 13th Part 5, again, it was taking a new direction. Part 4 was called The Final Chapter. It was supposed to be the last Friday the 13th movie. But then it made money, and that means there's going to be another one. So when they were coming up with the idea for Part 5, I actually kind of like the concept of basically, spoilers, you're dealing with a copycat killer in Part 5. Everybody thinks it's Jason because there's this legend of Jason Voorhees. But it turns out to be somebody imitating Jason, who's a totally separate person. Jason isn't in the movie, has nothing to do with it. I actually think that's a pretty cool way to build on the mythos that's created in your movie universe. Because, of course, how can you just keep doing these movies and people just forget that Jason's a thing? Which I think is a problem with the franchise, is that they don't acknowledge it enough. They do a little bit early on. Or, like, between, one of the things with Part 5 is that it has a recurring character. Tommy, whatever his name is a child in Part 4, is adolescent more or less in Part 5, and is also the protagonist of Part 6. So they do have a little bit of connecting stuff, but each time it's like, oh, have you ever heard about those string of murders way back when at Camp Crystal Lake? But, Jason himself is such an imposing and obvious character that it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't be known. So Part 5 I actually think is cool conceptually, as far as that goes. Unfortunately, there's a lot of reasons why this didn't work well. First and foremost, I think part of why this movie is so disliked, I think they had to do a lot of editing to it. They had to do an immense amount of editing to keep the rating reasonable. When you're dealing with the MPAA, which is, I guess, the Motion Picture Association of America, they're the ones that do the rating system. And basically, if you're going to try to release and get distributors for your movie, you can't really realistically go into NC-17 territory. It causes a lot of problems. Distributors won't carry you because that eliminates such a huge demographic into your theaters. So basically, to keep it at an R, they had to, or I guess it was either R or they were keeping it to PG-13. I'm honestly not sure. In any case, they wanted to bring in as many people as possible by keeping the rating low. And apparently this one was particularly a big victim of that. One of the things I noticed about this movie is all the deaths are very quick and vague, and there's not a lot of, like, for instance, one of the most memorable kills of the original Friday the 13th was a dude that was pinned to a door with arrows, and, like, these really over-the-top deaths. In this one, there's some interesting conceptual deaths, but they're clearly cutting around any kind of gore or shock value for the most part, apart from a decapitation I can think of. There's a lot of sort of cutting, and it winds up all the kills look very similar, and a lot of them happen off screen. We don't actually see a lot of the deaths, which for Friday the 13th, that's part of why people are watching these movies, is for, seeing the creative practical effects and such of the gore effects and that sort of thing. And this missed a lot of that. Also, this one's also a little weird, tonally, I thought. None of them are sophisticated. This is not a sophisticated franchise, but this one in particular felt childish. Like, there's a really more... With Jason, you're expecting sort of, like, with the soundtrack, for example. Just sort of tones, for the most part. Nothing like... Certainly not 80s pop music. This thing is so damn 80s. It is immensely 80s.
Cold, no life was in his eyes. He had a look so hard, I've never seen him smile. I could have told you then, you heard it all before. And now you're in suspense, you have to wait for more. In all those mysteries, you're taken by surprise. You never thought to see that look was in his eyes. There's a man with no life in his eyes. There's a man with no life in his eyes.
I've already talked about it. I don't really mind the fact that it wasn't Jason. I thought that was an interesting enough concept, but they also didn't leave enough clues. Like, they sort of do a whodunit sort of concept, but there's only really one scene that's relevant to who Jason, the fake Jason, is. And they never don't, like, drop hints or anything about it. They don't make it interesting or intriguing for the audience. You can't piece it together, really, unless you were paying attention at that one scene and was aware that Jason isn't actually here. And there's a few red herrings, but it's just not detailed enough. There's not enough going on. The characters are also just really badly written. Either that or they cut a lot, because they're really more one-dimensional than usual. And they don't interact particularly realistically. The supposed main character of this is Tommy from the previous movie. But he doesn't actually get a lot of screen time and not a whole lot of lines because they're trying to make you think he's Jason or something. So instead, we wind up bouncing person to person, which is another problem with this. Instead of having it in sort of a single location where they're all stuck together and Jason's hunting them down and splitting them up and cutting them up, we see a lot of Crystal Lake. Like, he's going into town and, like, hunting people down. Like, never before, until I talk about Part 8, has there been so much expansion into the town and stuff. Like, until he goes into space. Like, yeah, later on the Jason movies, like, Friday the 13th movies go off the rails a little bit. But in those early Friday the 13th movies, you're pretty much, the idea is everybody is more or less trapped in a single area, and then Jason sort of swims around them and picks them off, more or less, as they separate. And that's just not happening here. And it's weird. And all the deaths, like, we basically get introduced to characters and they immediately die. Like, why do we even bother? Characters are introduced to die, and none of them feel real. Like, there's these two characters of, like, a redneck mother and her adult son, and they're like caricatures. They're not... not people. We don't have any investment in them. I think that they were supposed to be like another red herring because, you know, mother-son relationship thing. But yeah, there's not. They're like cartoon characters. They're not. There's no peopleness to them. I think the main complaint people have about this, it comes from that fan rage. This is not a good movie. I don't think it's as bad a movie as people treat it. I think the biggest problems outside of the fan rage stuff of not having Jason in this movie, the problems is the writing of the characters, and then the cuts that were made to keep the rating down. I think if this had been more bloody and more traditionally Friday the 13th-y. Even with the sort of weird scope things, it would have been fine. But as it stands, there's enough, not little things, but minor things, not huge things, that all sort of culminated to make this what a lot of people say is the worst Friday the 13th movie. But I think the other contender for most people is Jason Takes Manhattan, and then Jason X, which I'm not going to talk about here. I personally don't. Jason X is sort of a self-parody, but anyway. So that's Friday the 13th Part 5. I don't recommend it, particularly because it is pretty boring, and the kills, whereas there are some creative ideas for kills in there, like sort of using a belt to crush someone into a tree. It's just not, it doesn't stand out. It certainly is not like a paragon of a Friday the 13th movie. And, you know, there's just a lot of stuff disregarding what the fans want and just weird tone things. Enough weird things to make it not great. So that's Friday the 13th Part 5. Now on to Friday the 13th Part 8. So Part 8 is called Jason Takes Manhattan. And, again, with the fan rage on this one. At least we do have Jason. Jason is in this. He is back. He's been back. He was resurrected in Part 6. In Part 7, he fights a psychic. I think that's the dumbest one.
Jason?
Friday the 13th, Part 7.
And then Part 7, he's stuck at the bottom of the lake and is resurrected when a couple teenagers throw an anchor overboard and it somehow severs a power line and shocks Jason back to life. Whatever. This one is primarily, I think people dislike this one first and foremost because it's deceptive. They pitched this and advertised it as Jason's going to be running amok in New York City.
Friday the 13th, Part 8. Jason Takes Manhattan. Now, New York has a new problem.
That's not actually what happened. I think maybe initially there was a write-up of the movie where that happened, but the question of how do we put Jason in Manhattan? The way they decided to do that was to have him basically hitch a ride on a cruise ship that's going to Manhattan. The problem with that is that they got really bogged down on the cruise ship part. And people, I think whoever was writing this might have been fascinated by the idea of having the cruise ship as a good sort of contained way to have everybody trapped. Like I was saying, that's an essential part of Friday the 13th. Everybody's sort of all together in one space, and then they can be isolated, and he picks them off. It's actually, if this was Jason on a boat, if that's how they titled it, it's actually a pretty cool idea. Or Jason on the High Seas, or whatever. I kind of wish they named the ship Argo. Anyway, so Jason, basically, there's a bunch of high schoolers. I think it's a senior trip to New York City. And they're all on this cruise ship. We have a couple professors that don't really care about, except one's kind of a dick. Our protagonist is afraid of water/drowning. And something that also is weird about this one, apart from the fact that we don't get New York till the very end of the movie, and even then we only get like one shot in Times Square, and then the rest is Canada. Filmed not in New York, which also annoyed people. Most of it's on the cruise ship, though. And I don't like the characters. The characters are not as poorly written as they were in Part 5, but they're not interesting, particularly. Something that didn't make sense is our protagonist is just someone who is afraid of drowning, and we find out that her guardian uncle person, took her to Crystal Lake and was like, "You need to learn to swim," and did this shitty thing that some people do of throwing their child in the water and seeing if they learn to swim real fast. So that's where he told her that Jason was in the water and was gonna pull her down, and if she hadn't learned to swim. And then the thing is, that's one thing if they use Jason to terrify her or whatever, but then they actually show Jason in the water trying to hold her down, and it's like, what the hell's going on here? It's stupid. It's the most tenuous connection possible. But anyway, for some reason, keep in mind, this character is not a psychic. Like, the character who's the lead in Part 7, which is super stupid, is a psychic. And can actually, like, control vines and telekinesis and stuff. In Part 8, this person is not a psychic, not clairvoyant. There's no reason to think that. Yet, she sees images of Jason holograms of Jason as a child. In, like, windows and mirrors and crap. What the hell's going on? That's never happened in any Friday the 13th movie before. It's not even that clever or interesting. So there's a lot of that, and of course, as typical, Jason, isolates people. There are some okay deaths, I guess, in this one. The one that stood out most to me is that he killed someone with a guitar early on. But, in general, we stick on the cruise ship for a while on the way to New York. If I remember correctly, he actually ultimately sinks the boat, and then the 5 odd survivors, wind up in a life raft and getting to New York City. And then he continues following them there, and that's towards the end of the movie. And then he basically chases them down as this sort of collective and starts, taking them out one by one. Ultimately, there's 2 survivors in this one. Sometimes there's 1, sometimes there's 2. Yeah, the other thing that's really dumb in this one is how Jason is defeated. I don't know if this is a thing. This sort of struck me as a bit chuddy, as in, like, Chud, the movie. There's just vats of toxic waste hanging around New York in the sewers, and a sewer line of super toxic waste that can melt flesh. I don't think that's a thing. So anyway, I want to say Jason kills one guy by picking him up upside down and dunking him into this vat of toxic waste. And then Jason ultimately, they're crawling in the sewers, and then some guy's like, "What are you doing down here? We're about to flush a bunch of toxic waste down this pipe." And apparently it's like not just sewer waste, it's gonna melt your skin waste. So they get out, and somehow Jason is left down there, and then he is just, he gets hit by this toxic waste stuff, and his face starts melting. And yeah, he's pretty much destroyed, but he keeps chasing them until, a big flood of it comes. And then instead of him, like, dissolving or something, he turns into his child form. And it's not even the same design. Like, Jason, under the mask, this is sort of notorious throughout the series, changes his appearance under the mask movie to movie. Like different designers did different stuff. This under the mask Jason looks far worse than the one from the movies previous. Dramatically worse. And the design of him as a kid has totally changed. He doesn't look anything like he did back in the earlier movies. And also, why is he turning back into a kid? Did it melt him into being a child? Is that how toxic waste works? Is toxic waste like a magical, like surgical miracle thing that can make you look young after it tears all your flesh off? I don't think so. There's a lot of stuff wrong with that. So Jason's defeated, sort of, more or less. It's even more boring. I don't know. I don't think it's quite as boring. It gets a little more right. I do think that it's better than Part 5. I think the concept, both of them I think had good concepts. That's where I think they're really similar, is that if you take Jason and put him on a cruise ship, that's not a bad idea. It works for the concept, I think. But it was not marketed as such. It was marketed as Jason topples New York. It's just the same way Part 5 has this interesting concept of, a copycat to Jason, but it wasn't marked as that. It was, marketed as A New Beginning, heavily implying the return of Jason.
If the memory of Jason still haunts you, you're not alone. Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning.
And when that didn't happen with both of those movies, that made the fan bases very upset. There are plenty of other inadequacies in both movies. Don't get me wrong, it's not just the nerd rage that made these so, maligned. They're certainly bad, but I think that played a more than a not insignificant part of why they're so maligned. That's Friday the 13th, Part 5 and Part 8. Anyway, they're both pretty bad. They've both fallen out of the bottom 100 at this point. They're still pretty neck and neck. Jason X, again, is self-parody, more or less. Some people dislike that one, but I need to rewatch it, but I am pretty staunch that I think Part 7 is a more embarrassing, stupid idea than either of these. The idea of Jason on a cruise ship, not bad, kind of creative, can work. The idea of Jason, a Jason copycat, not bad. That's an interesting concept for a movie. The idea of Jason fighting a telekinetic psychic is just stupid. There's no reason for it. There's no precedent there. There's no reason to even say that psychics exist in this world, in this universe. And also, he gets attacked by psychic vines and crap. What was that? What was that movie? And every time I hear people talk about, the worst of the Friday the 13th, people just gloss over that. It's like, oh, yeah, that's the one with the psychic. It's like, no. Let's really talk about that. So I think the difference is, it took a stupid concept and then more or less made a Friday the 13th movie around it. I don't even think it's a very good one. Again, I think it's the worst of the actual Friday the 13th movies. But yeah, whereas I think these other two actually have the core of a concept, and it was more the marketing and the way that they had to be cut to keep the ratings, and then, again, there are other problems. That's not the extent of it. They both have other problems involved, like poor makeup effects, or bad writing, bad characters, but yeah, that's essentially what I'm saying. I don't recommend either of them unless you want to watch them all, but I think that their reputations are overblown a little bit. I think that nerd rage, again, just like with the Mario Brothers movie, just like with a lot of these movies that are either adapted or sequels to movies with a big fan base, nerd rage is a huge part in both of these movies, their popular reception. So yeah, that's Friday the 13th, Part 5 and 8, and a little bit of 7.